Well, I'm in that unenviable position of being the last speaker before lunch, and I don't want to keep you all too long because otherwise nasty things can happen up here. I think we had an absolutely stellar opening this morning. I think this has really been an outstanding conference so far, and I particularly enjoyed John's sweeping presentation and energetic presentation, to say the least. I would also say that what this all really kind of reflects, yet again, is how much in our field we really stand on the shoulders of giants. You know, people who have worked in this field for a number of years, who have done some extraordinary work, very detailed work. People like John, three that come to my mind in particular: Jack Bruce, who's no longer with us, Peter Grosch, of course, and John Cuneo. We don't hear so much of John Cuneo these days, but if you go back to the old Winged Mars, it's amazing how well that work is held up. Now, what I thought I'd give you today is a bit of a shotgun approach to looking at World War I and looking at some of the issues involved in World War I and some of the fallout effects of World War I. So here goes. First of all, I'm struck by the fact that I think societies are really all about uncertainty. And we can view this almost in terms of aircraft flight control laws. You know, basically, if we take a look at them, societies exhibit long-term Foucault-type motions. These are socioeconomic, political in nature. They have varying periodicity, and they're all very poorly damped. What this means is if you have a very sudden input, a very violent input, you can really see a transformation. For that matter, if you have a political input, you know, you can really see a change in the direction of a country or a society. Now, much of this is normal. You know, much of this is the way simply I think societies work and how human history works itself out. You know, we talk about big historical movements, and you've had people try to come up with models of history, but basically history is the working of people through time. If you want to really understand what's going on, study the people, study their background, where they come from, what they're thinking about. Certainly that's true if you take a look at military operations. You know, for example, why did the Russians at Tannenberg not emphasize the airplane? Well, basically the two commanders are cavalry commanders. They are wedded to cavalry as a means of getting intelligence, but we'll get into that a little bit later. When you're dealing with an unstable situation, when you're dealing with a society like this, you have to really measure and anticipate events. And because of this, the danger of departure is quite extreme, as well as misinterpretation. I'll make a comparison. If you can get hold of the latest issue of Vanity Fair, the October issue of Vanity Fair magazine, there's a really thoughtful and disturbing article in it by William Langebiche on the crash of an Air France jetliner over the South Atlantic, where the crew simply lost all situational awareness. Three very senior people simply came unglued during the time that this aircraft was heading downhill and could not sort out some very basic things. In a larger sense, if we take a look at this notion of uncertainty, misinterpretation, the dynamic effects of a violent input, World War I has all those in spades. And here's the violent input, of course, that causes it all. Basically, a unsettled terrorist who happens to have access to a weapon, which in its own way becomes a weapon of mass destruction, if you think about it. And then he has that unfortunate chance opportunity due to a driver's mistake in driving through Sarajevo, where he finds himself, after a previous assassination attempt that day has failed, he finds himself in a position where he can alter history. What came out of that? What came out of that is the world we're in today. You know, we take a look back at World War I, and I think certainly because history is taught so badly these days, frankly, there's this idea to kind of put it on a shelf, think of it way back there, ancient history, not much related to what we're doing. We're still in the era of World War I. We're still feeling the effects of World War I, and we will continue to feel the effects of World War I think playing out at least over the next century, basically. It led to the absolute destruction of an established system that because of that then came completely unglued. It was like pulling the crankshaft out of an engine or something, and it unleashed a whole variety of things, the isms that we're all confronting basically today. Both sides played the radical Islamist card, trying to spin up the Islamic world to their cause, and to a degree, we're the inheritors of those foolish decisions made both by the Allies and Central Powers in that time period. The direct consequences were 200 million dead. Why? Because I take a look at World War II, it's absolutely coming out of it, and it continues to be reflected in the trouble we see today in the Mideast, in Crimea, in the various unsettlements that we have, even in the Far Eastern world as well. In short, the Great War really is our Peloponnesian War. That's the way we really need to look at it. And just like there was a gap in the Peloponnesian War, if you read Thucydides, between the first Peloponnesian War and the second, we had that gap in the last century between World War I and World War II. So the bottom line here basically is that if we take a look at it, dynamic instability is society's natural norm. War becomes a manifestation of that. We cannot expect to prevent or eliminate it. You know, we'll always have people that talk about eliminating war, preventing war, et cetera, et cetera. At best, you can control and contain it. Those who try to employ so-called rational orthodoxies to overcome it, well, we've seen some of those rational orthodoxies in full fury. If we take a look at communism, or fascism, or Nazism, as you can see that they don't work very well in doing exactly that. So the bottom line is we have a legacy here that of continued conflict that we can expect to go on for quite a while, fulfilling the old biblical prescription that only the dead have seen the end of war. Now, within that same century, before we all go out and take Valium or something, within that same century, we had some pretty remarkable accomplishments. You know, if you take a look across the field of science and technology, just the basic way we learn about things, communications, knowledge, computational revolution, the propulsion revolution, medical revolution. I mean, you know, you take a look at the increase in average lifespan, the development of whole categories of drugs to address ailments that just decades ago were killers, that, you know, a diagnosis was a death sentence, basically. You know, we find, I think, that there's some really fantastic things here. Just taking a look at the aerospace revolution as one example of this, you know, it's kind of remarkable that we have the first flight of the airplane in 1903. As John has pointed out, we have its first combat application in 1911. We have the first flight of a liquid fuel rocket in 1926. By 1944, we start having the rocket used as a strategic weapon, or a terror weapon in that case. But you know, you just take a look at these various milestones and you think of how we've transformed things. You know, for example, the introduction of the jet airliner that by the end of the last century was giving us 600 million people a year flying through the world's skies. Really quite remarkable. Think of hurricanes, the problem that hurricanes posed to various societies until we had the advent of space-based weather. Now one would never expect that you would have a hurricane sneak up suddenly on a coast. Now, continuing the same theme of uncertainty, we can take a look at the issue of military innovation, because military innovation certainly gives you anticipated outcomes. You know, you figure to develop something to meet some operational need, or you have technology push where the technology, as in the case of low observables, for example, gives you the opportunity to do something you haven't thought about. But there's unanticipated outcomes as well, and these unanticipated outcomes can have very profound strategic implications, and they can have very profound geostrategic and political implications as well. So therefore, you actually get an increase rather than a decrease in uncertainty. And the example I'd offer is not an aeronautical one, but is, in fact, a naval one, and that is the development of HMS Dreadnought in 1906. Because Jackie Fisher, wanting to maintain British naval supremacy and very cognizant of the remarkable state of ship design, particularly Charles Parsons' development of the steam turbine. Then you had the development of centralized fire control, stuff like this. You had the development of new and much more powerful cannon. Decided to package all this in a single vessel, and so the end result is you get HMS Dreadnought, which is the most advanced warship of its day. And as Admiral Tirpitz said when he looked at it, the British have only one. In other words, what you can have, what this did was reset the playing field, reset the clock. And so Germany, which up to that point had thought of its navy largely in terms strictly of coastal defense, Germany instead embarks on a major naval race with Britain. And as you're all aware, the two fleets come into conflict at Jutland, and the strategic and tactical outcomes of Jutland are still debated. Certainly, the outcome was not what the Royal Navy expected at that time. So you saw the development of German dreadnoughts, and then, of course, today, trying to extrapolate from that, I'd say today a relevant example would be remotely piloted aircraft. I think it's quite remarkable that we already see what we would ostensibly describe as terrorist groups making use of RPA technology, and I think pretty soon you'll see them starting to use RPA technology to achieve a weapons effect, weapons on target effect, whether it's with bugs and drugs or whether it's with munitions or things of this sort. Okay, so the bottom line here is that even if you have then a relatively immature technology, and we can go back now and take a look at aircraft, even if you have a relatively immature innovative system, it completely transforms operational constructs, the way people looked at conflict, and that, of course, can have some profound consequences in terms of your strategic outcomes. And that is, provided you can get by the skeptics. Now, Ferdinand Foix, we have to cut the guy a little bit of slack, okay? He's a very bright guy. He's in charge of the French War Academy at this time. He's attending a French air show in 1910, and he's sort of ambush interviewed by a reporter, and so his reflexive answer when the reporter says, "What value do airplanes have for the military?" he says, "Aviation has zero value for the Army." Well, to give him credit, he was thinking very differently of it by the end of 1916, as we'll see. But as John has pointed out, when you start taking a look then at what was happening in the real world, first when you start having military exercises in which the airplane gave a hint of its value, and then when you started having actual combat application, as sporadic as it was, particularly the major demonstration that you had in Italy and then some of the Balkan War impact, then you had a very different thing. Now, there was a question raised in the Q&A about were these developments undertaken in isolation. Actually, if you take a look at the military literature of the day, the Russi Journal, for example, some of the journals of the French military journals, Journal of Coastal Artillery by the U.S. Army in this country, you find that there were professional articles that actually were surprisingly cognizant and perceptive in terms of the value of air. And so because of that, we see that when the Great War comes along, it acts as John pointed out, a confirmation of some of the indications you had in that pre-war era, but it also becomes, because the Great War, the stakes are so great, it becomes a major forcing field for the technology of the airplane, particularly since the airplane shows its value very early on as a reconnaissance platform. And I'd just point out to add in my own brief way to John's excellent paper, it's striking to me that when we take a look at overhead observational systems, whether we're talking about balloons or aircraft or Earth satellites or remotely piloted aircraft today, the first use they've been put to is what we now call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Okay. Opening force structure. Now, numbers vary depending on the sources you go to, but if you take a look at the TOA, Table of Allowances of the various combatant forces, and you take a look at some of their official histories and stuff like this, these are the numbers that break out. You basically had a 2-to-1 disparity in favor of the Allies over the Central Powers at the opening of the war. I threw Italy and the United States in there, not because we're involved at the outset, as you know, we're not, but because we come in later. So if you take a look overall, there's a pretty healthy number there of aircraft that's available. Now, are all these airworthy? No. Many of these are not. It's very difficult to actually find out what the actual operational force structure is that forces actually take into combat. Although I will say that if you go to the official histories, the Reich-Archives series on the war, and if you take a look, for example, at the French and German accounts, you find that actually, the French and British accounts, Sir Walter Raleigh's classic history, you find that actually they're pretty reliable on this. Now, the opening month, as John pointed out, by the end of the opening month, there was no doubt that the airplane had tremendous value and you had to do something about it. What you basically had to do was you had to defend against it. That, of course, drives the development of the fighter airplane because you need to deny access to your side of the line to enemy aircraft. And if you don't have this capability, you need to develop the capability of observational reconnaissance. Take a look at Tannenberg in particular. There is a consensus, undoubtedly there is a consensus that the Germans were reading Russian message traffic. However, I would also point out that much of the German message traffic, because of the exigencies of the operation, the pace of the operation, was also sent in the open. And so the Russians did not seem to have a very effective intelligence apparatus. A U.S. Army War College study, I should say Command and Staff College study, after the war concluded that the Russians basically, their intelligence apparatus was completely dysfunctional in the conflict. But I would say that while the Germans had an idea of strategic intent, in part because after the Battle of Gumbinnen, they had found operational plans in the body of a Russian officer. And though they were getting these indications from ELINT, basically, electronic intelligence, and comment, what was lacking was the ability to turn that into tactical and operational level intelligence at the tactical and operational level of war. And this is where air power was very, very important. If you take a look at the German message traffic between commanders, and you take a look at what's happening during the day-to-day onset, almost hour-to-hour onset of the Battle of Tannenberg, and how the forces in the 8th Army are repositioned to confront Samsonov's corps forces, and basically how then they work to isolate each of his corps and break each corps, you find that that was where the air reconnaissance was critical. General Matos, the 15th Corps commander for the Russian Second Army, Samsonov's army, said the enemy aviators observed us with impunity. What is not appreciated is that the 8th Army launched observational reconnaissance operations against the Russians even before the Russians crossed into Prussian territory. They were actually doing long-range reconnaissance and then followed them all the way across the border and as they approached. Now, one does develop the feeling that there is a better intelligence, actionable intelligence assessment process taking place on the Eastern Front with Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and Hofmann than there is on the Western Front with Bülow and Klug and then the overarching nemesis of Moltke behind them. Definitely things work better in terms of German aerial reconnaissance in the East than they do in the West. I think actually, taking a look at Hindenburg's comment, without the M and no Tannenberg, ohne Flieger kein Tannenberg, as he is reported to have said, I think he's reflecting this operational, tactical level contribution, not so much strategic contribution of air intelligence. Now, taking a look at the Battle of the Marne, it's a very different thing. The German airmen do very good work in the Battle of the Marne in terms of giving situational reports. However, the process of getting that information in a timely fashion to the German Army commanders is broken. It doesn't work. And so there is this fleeting intelligence opportunity, as we would say today. Fleeting intelligence is not turned into actionable intelligence. It was a process that caused them real problems. In contrast, from Mons on through the Marne, the Allies had a very different way of using air and using it effectively. And I think this comment by Smith-Dorrien, Second Corps commander in the British Expeditionary Force, is quite interesting, that he makes about the routine British use of aerial reconnaissance. The German air presence was much more profound in terms of artillery control, and I think it's kind of interesting to take a look there in General Sir Henry Wilson's comment. About the Marne, if you take a look at it, is really kind of a non-battle. What's really funny is that thanks to an untimely staff assistance visit from the headquarters, the German Army headquarters, by a lieutenant colonel who's empowered to act with the authority of Moltke, you find that basically there is this rush to withdraw, so that the titanic clash that one could have expected did not really take place. In fact, if you take a look at the German accounts after the battle, you find that there were some individuals within Klug's army who were absolutely livid at this insistence that Klug withdraw to join with the timid Bülow and move their forces back, and then eventually we get, of course, the race to the coast and the development of trench warfare as we know it. So it's a very, very complex business. As far as Tannenberg is concerned, there was an unseemly debate broke out in the 1920s among all the senior commanders. Hindenburg stayed a little bit above it, between Hindenburg, Ludendorff, Hofmann, some others, on who actually won the battle. And of course, some of you have probably heard that classic anecdote that Hindenburg was at a cocktail party in Berlin, and this woman said, "General, who actually won the Battle of Tannenberg?" And he said, "Madam, I do not know who won it. I only know who would have lost it." So, moving right along, the bottom line here, and this echoes what we heard very much from John's presentation, is that air reconnaissance profoundly influenced the subsequent course and conduct of the war just within weeks of the opening of the war. And when we take a look at this, we have to extrapolate even further. This reflects profoundly the strategic course and conduct of the war, the outcome of the war. The entire pace of 20th century history is basically transformed simply by a few airmen in a few aircraft. Okay, so Foch completely turns around, and by late 1916, we're seeing Foch as an extreme enthusiast of aviation, so much so that in the post-World War I era, Foch, working with the Michelin brothers, becomes a very strong advocate of French air preparedness and French air mindedness. Okay, why was air so significant? Because the war's an artillery war. If you take a look at the weight of artillery fire, I thought these two photographs are kind of telling. Basically, even to this day, you have French farmers that are occasionally killed by blowing up an unexploded shell from that time period. It's astonishing when you take a look at the ratio of artillery in all armies to combat forces and how that played out over the length of the war. Now, the other point we can make is if we take a look at air power today, with the exception of air transport, all the roles and missions that air forces and naval aviation forces conduct today were first promulgated, explored, and routinely put into service during the First World War, starting with reconnaissance, starting with air attack. Within 3 hours of the opening of the war, you had the first German bombing of the French town of Luneville with a guy who came over and dropped 6 small bombs over that town in a Taube. You have, of course, the whole development of air superiority warfare, what we would call today air supremacy. You have battlefield air attack, maritime patrol. You have over 40 vessels sunk during the First World War by air action, 15 of which are warships, 12 of which are submarines. You have sea-based air attack. You have a carrier raid in July 1918, in which the carrier Furious launches bomb-loaded Camels to take out a weapon of mass destruction. The German airship sheds at Tondern. They do so successfully. You have special operations right from the outset of the war, within weeks of the outset of the war. You have the infiltration and extraction of agents. You even have the parachuting of agents into occupied territories before the end of the war. So basically, this is an aspect of the war that is still with us, that gives us, I think, another sense that this is not just some quaint activity we need to look at from afar. What I'm particularly interested in, as you all know, is I'm kind of an airplane nut in the sense of looking at aviation technology and how people lose the plot, so to speak, and how they get it back and whatnot. And what's really interesting to me is that we invented the airplane in 1903, but by 1909, we were already losing control of it. And the reason we were losing control of it was because the Wright brothers, although they knew how to invent the first airplane, they really didn't know how to invent the second. And then, being socialistically inclined, they felt, well, we'll control the technology by going to the courts. And so what they do is they wind up suing everybody in sight who comes up with a better idea. The way you win technology battles is in the marketplace. You don't win them in court. And so the end result is everybody else went way past us. And so by 1912, we have this disparity in aircraft design. There's the Depot design monocoque, beautiful machine. If you get to Paris, got to go to the Musée de l'Air, absolutely. And when you take a look at that aircraft, it's still breathtaking, really, when you think of the time period in which it's developed. And then you have this kind of sad-looking thing that's called a Speed Scout, and you take a look at the performance disparity between them, I think you suddenly get a feeling here of what's going on. Now, as a consequence, for the United States, we're really out of the fight. John Pershing, General Pershing, in his final after-action report, has this particular sentence which I think summarizes it better than anything else you can see. We do not get back our edge in aeronautics until arguably 1933. You know, we have a number of developments that take place in the 1920s and the early 1930s. But 1933 is really the annus mirabilis, if you will, of American aviation in terms of its recovery back from what had happened in the time period from, say, 1907, 1908 onwards through the Great War. The industrial dimension of the war is something we need to think about. Again, we're seeing this, I think, in the commemorations. Certainly if you take a look at what's taken place so far and the way that people are looking at the war, they're strictly looking at it through the perspective of somebody in a trench, okay? The idea that the war had larger dimensions, the idea that the war was really a war of mechanization in many ways, and that you had a drive toward logistical support, that you had drives in all sorts of other areas, communications, that were really quite profound, I think is largely being missed. In terms of aeronautics, we have over 200,000 airplanes built during the wartime years. We have over 235,000 engines built. Once again, numbers vary depending on the source. But I would argue that these figures are probably accurate within 2 to 4%, something like that. They're pretty accurate figures coming from official sources. The bottom line here is that you have the development of an aeronautical process here in terms of manufacturing and making of aircraft. And you start to see an evolution of the airplane that's really quite dramatic. You know, we can take a look at it in these terms. In 1914, the average airplane was an aircraft that had performance that was far less than a remotely piloted aircraft today. And indeed, for that matter, less in some respects than some of the ultralight aircraft that you have today. In 1919, you have 3 flights across the North Atlantic. You have the NC-4, which hops across. You have the Alcock and Brown and a modified Vickers-Vimy. If you take a look at the airship world, I'm not a huge airship guy, frankly. You have an out and back by the R-34. So, you know, we see this transformation. There's other ways of looking at this as well in terms of the science and technology of flight, and we'll get into that. You know, we can just kind of take a look at this evolution by taking a look at German fighters at the beginning of the war and at the end of the war. Okay, beginning of the war, Fokker-Rheindecker, a modified scouting aircraft, you know, relatively modest performance. What it really has going for it is the fact that it's carrying a forward-firing gun. In virtually all other respects, it's a very modest performing machine. Late war, we have an aircraft that actually looks like it would be not all that out of place on an airfield in the late 1920s or early 1930s of all-metal aircraft design. You know, what really amazes me here is that we have the invention of the airplane in 1903. We have the military airplane appear in 1908 and 1909. But in terms of really practical aircraft that can really do things, you don't really have much of that until World War I. And yet in 1918, we have the recasting of the aircraft into modern, streamlined, cantilever, all-metal form. That's really quite remarkable. You know, we can take a look at this aircraft, corrugated surfaces, things like this. But in all other respects, this is a very, very advanced design. And what it really reflects is it reflects the growing power of the science and technology of flight. From the time of Da Vinci up through the Wright brothers, we were largely bird imitative. We believed very much in thin airfoils because birds had thin wings. And so if you were going to make a thin airfoil, then you needed to have some sort of robust structure keeping this wing intact. And so Octave Chanute gives to us the bridge truss, the flying bridge truss type approach, if you will, of a biplane configuration, cross-braced. You have variations of this, the Warren truss, stuff like that. But basically, what this gave you was a very high drag configuration. If you had a monoplane configuration, you still had that high drag configuration because you had the thin wing and all sorts of bracing struts above and below the wing. Think of the Taube, for example, as one example, or for that matter, any other early monoplane. The great advantage of science and technology was that people started studying aeronautics not in terms of imitating birds, but in terms of actually what was happening in a fluid dynamic sense around the wing. What was the actual circulation of air around a wing? What was the fluid flow around the wing? How did that behave? What did that tell us about the way an aircraft would be designed? And what came out of that very quickly is that fluid flow loves a thick wing. And if you have a thick wing, then all of a sudden that gives you the opportunity of putting a cantilever structure on the inside of that wing. The great pioneer was, on the aerodynamic sense, was Ludwig Prandtl at the University of Göttingen, and his disciples, chief among them an individual named Max Monk. And in the structure sense, the great pioneer was Hugo Junkers, although there were others that cascaded out of that very quickly, Adolf Rohrbach, Claude Dornier, people of that sort. They gave to us a revolution that Germany was not able to really exploit because it lost the war, but which we were able to exploit in the United States very, very quickly thereafter. You know, it's very interesting to me that the United States in the 20s and early 1930s really adapts to the monoplane very, very quickly. And it's largely because we paid for and bought and got the services of a whole lot of people. We brought, for example, Max Monk to the United States, put him in charge of airfoil development for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, completely built then the aeronautical engineering enterprise in the United States, the so-called Daniel Guggenheim Schools, which came out of the Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics in the 1920s. This completely reshaped American aeronautics. It was a very, very important moment. Now, aircraft types, you know, we can just kind of go down memory lane here. You take a look at the rudimentary aircraft at the beginning or even the middle phase of the war. They're still having an effect, as John and others have shown. These still have an effect. But by late war, we're actually going after target sets. We're actually defining target sets. We're actually defining air campaigns. We're coming up with coherent bombing theory. If you take a look at the Independent Force, if you take a look at theory, the work of Douay, you know, people of this sort, in some cases they've been denigrated. Now we're finding, from the long view of history, they're coming back into the fore. For example, for a long time there was a belief that Douay's work was interesting, it was theoretical, it didn't have influence on anybody, nobody read it. Well, guess what? We actually went to the archives and we found the original manuscripts, and we found who checked them out, and we found who read them, and we found that they were taught, and we found that they were appreciated. Surprise, surprise at that. Okay, ground attack, very sporadic at the beginning. You know, basically you take a obsolescing fighter aircraft or a reconnaissance aircraft that you're using to throw a few bombs over the side or something of that sort. By the 1918 time period, you're seeing sophisticated ground attackers that are A-10s of their day. They're armored aircraft, they're very, very capable, they're very, very powerful. More importantly, when we take a look at Allied combat accounts from the surface warfare perspective, we find that these are getting the attention of ground commanders. These are things that ground commanders find that they can no longer ignore. The same with maritime aviation. Maritime aviation actually in some respects was kind of a missed opportunity, I think, in many ways in the war. It was not effective at Jutland, largely because of circumstance, and I think it could have had some quite profound implications had it been. But by the end of the First World War, we're starting to see the proto-evolution of what we would consider the carrier battle group. You know, certainly if you take a look at the Tondren raid, and these are the camels on that raid being prepared for the attack in July 1918 in an Imperial War Museum photo, certainly there's a sophistication here and an end result in effect that needs to be taken to mind. And finally, we must not ignore the civil, military, industrial base implications of what took place in the war. This is the Junkers F-13 of 1919, which is already starting to enter airline service. It's just at the beginning of that. You see one of the Junkers D-1 fighters in the background, and this is obviously a publicity photo. It's from the Bissell collection right here in the National Air and Space Museum, the National Museum of the United States Air Force Archives, I should say. And I think it's really kind of once again, it's kind of a remarkable photo. You know, you take a look at this and you think 1903, you have an airplane that takes off, you know, flies about 120 feet or so and 40 mile an hour top end speed and dynamically unstable. The guys are very lucky to keep it in the air over that time. And then you take a look at this thing and you suddenly realize now we're actually carrying people who can pay the freight, so to speak. It gives a dramatic indication of both the forcing function of the technology in that war and then the end results of it. I'd like to leave you with one final quote. And the final quote is by a great practitioner of military affairs, Heinz Guderian, who made this very interesting statement in his book Achtung Panzer, written in the 1930s, about air attack, recognizing then that there would be this very strong interplay between the air and ground attacker, as we had seen from 1917 onwards. He writes of the war, aircraft became an offensive weapon of the first order, distinguished by their great speed, range, and effect on target. If their initial development experienced a check when hostilities came to an end in 1918, they had already shown their potential clearly enough to those who were on the receiving end. Thanks very much. I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah. You mentioned drone aircraft early on, and a thought came to me. Do you think we'll see drone fighters to protect the drone reconnaissance?
Yeah, I do. Let's take a look at this real quickly. First of all, if we take a look at drones, we can go all the way back to World War I, because as you all know, there were experiments with guided weapons in World War I that we would say, in today's terms, were drones, okay? You know, think about the air-to-air fighter today. The air-to-air fighter uses as its principal weapon an air-to-air missile. Think of that air-to-air missile. It has capabilities that in the 1950s we would have regarded as so unique. If you take a look at an AMRAAM, for example, an AIM-120, that we would have considered then, as the term went, a robotic aircraft. You know, remember in the 1950s, when we were developing some of these missile technologies, we gave them aircraft designations. The B-65 became the SM-65, which was the Atlas missile. The Bomark missile started out as the F-99. The Falcon air-to-air missile started out as the F-98. It shows that people were thinking of these in those terms, okay? Now, the problem you always have is technical over-expectation. And when you couple that with unrealistic rules of engagement and a misapprehension about combat roles and missions, you can get into real trouble, as we found in Vietnam. You know, we had to completely relearn air combat. We had to completely relearn the value of hard maneuvering air combat, the idea of an air supremacy fighter. We also had to recognize we had to treat our missiles very kindly. If you take a missile and you're uploading it on a dolly and you're taking it out then to load on a fighter and you bounce it over the FOD strips and you have card electronics inside, it's probably not going to do them very good. So the bottom line is that you have to treat that missile with some tender loving care. If you do that, by the way, the Brits had the same experience with surface-to-air missiles in the Falklands. The difference between the Army handling rounds, where they thought of it as simply like an artillery shell, and the Royal Air Force, which treated them like little airplanes, guess who got the better result? Well, there it is. Looking at drones today, we have to recognize something. There's been a tremendous confluence in aviation technology between the classic aerodynamic structures propulsion control revolution, and then the revolution in computers and systems. We first gave pilots instrumentation to help them fly the airplane safely. We refined the airplane to the point that the pilot could concentrate on flying the mission, not flying the plane. The technology of controls and sensors came along then that gave the plane even new and more unique capabilities. Think of the systems airplanes of the late 1950s, early 1960s, the A6, the F-111 being good examples. But then when we got into the modern era of Moore's Law, doubling computational power every 18 months with no end in sight even now to that enabled you to do some truly remarkable things. We are operating not merely in the classic physical sciences world that we think about, but we are operating as well in a cloud world, okay? And so if you take a look at aircraft technology today is all about communicating among disparate systems and coordinating activities. Everything is a sensor platform. Everything has a communications value to it. This is why if you take a look at a system like the F-22 or the F-35, you have to be very, very careful if you are thinking of these as just classic fighter airplanes. They're very, very different. The way that you are netting and using and exploiting that information means that you are now taking advantage of airborne sensors, space-based sensors, other aircraft systems, special operators in the ground, whatever else is out there. We will see that applied increasingly in the drone world. We're seeing it now, frankly. We will see the tremendous netting of drones, and that's actually something I really worry about, because drone technology is achievable today very cheaply, extremely reasonably, at extremely small levels, and the potential here for havoc is tremendous. You think of a drone with dispensing bugs and drugs, you know, whatever it is you're looking at, you can have some very, very serious issues come up here very, very quickly. Now, the FAA, you know, the model of the FAA, people have said jokingly, is we're not happy until you're not happy. The FAA, I do sympathize with them somewhat, and they're trying to come to grips with how to handle regulation of drone activities, because I'll tell you, you don't want a very large drone coming downhill in a hurry. I'm reminded of a test flight in probably about the 1990, 1991 time period. We had a Global Hawk flying out of, it was either Edwards or Palmdale, I guess it was Edwards, and it was just north of the city of California City near Mojave. And about 275 miles away in Nellis Air Force Base was I guess it was Creech actually, the Indian Springs Auxiliary Air Force Base north of Nellis in those days. There was a drone operator who had this big red button in front of him, and it said Global Hawk Destruct System. And I guess seriously bored, he thought, gee, I wonder if this thing works. And he presses the button, not knowing that 275 miles away there was a Global Hawk actually flying. It proceeded to blow its wing off, and it came spinning down. Now remember, this is a vehicle the size of a 727 jetliner. It had just passed over California City about 5 minutes before that. Had it come down, it could have caused some very serious damage. So, you know, that's the issue we're facing with these drones. You know, you get clonked in the head by one of these little helicopter type things. You know, F equals MA in any language in the world. You know, and it's, you know, it's something we're going to have to think about. But yeah, I see a huge future for drones. But once again, it's a very uncertain future. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, years ago, you mentioned that the transport function of the aircraft wasn't introducible. Well, years ago, I read an account of a special where the Germans stripped out a WD-11 seaplane or 14 in the attack on Uzal Island there, and they put a machine gun crew with the men there and made a bus out of it for that special attack. So that would have been an example.
Yeah, that's a very good example, actually. That's an extremely good example. The idea of mass transport of people and cargo was what was missing, you know. And we needed the capabilities of the transport aircraft of the 1930s to do that. You needed, at a minimum, something like a Ju-52 equivalent. And it was even better if you had something like a C-47 equivalent, you know. And when you start looking at that, you know, obviously then in World War II, you're getting up to the point that by 1945, we're having 200 flights a week across the North Atlantic, and you're having resupply over the hump. But that was a long way off. During World War I, though, there were, in the special operations sense, there was the transportation of people and agents. And the example you give there is a very interesting one. For example, one thing we don't often think about is that when you take a look at some of these aircraft, I was struck by the film presentation initially showing Farman long-range bombers that didn't make it into World War I. Immediately after the war, those were turned into cross-channel airliners. You know, you have the development of civil aviation very, very quickly between Britain and then within and throughout the continent, very, very rapidly. In fact, by the early 1930s, you're able to fly an airplane all the way from England, depending on your connections. You can fly all the way to the Far East through various lines, through all of Central Asia, and that's pretty remarkable development when you think about it. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You might be repeating some of what you said about drones, but I'm just wondering if you think we're going to see a similar thing play out in space this century. We've already had a couple of satellite shoot-downs.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Satellites are doing a reconnaissance role.
Yeah.
When are we going to start seeing them interfering with each other?
You know, people talk about, I'm always amused by people talking about the militarization of space. How are we going to see the militarization of space? How are we going to see the militarization of space? It's already militarized. You know, when you're killing a guy with a JDAM that's cued from a satellite, that's space warfare. You know, the instrument may be a B-52 at 40,000 feet or you know, F-18 or whatever it is, or, you know, some other vehicle out there. But when you're getting your navigational positioning, your weather positioning, and then your weapon cueing from space, that's space warfare, you know, frankly. And so actually taking a look at warfare within space, yes, I would be, you know, once again, you know, the idea that we're going to be able to eliminate this is just fanciful. You know, it's going to be there. Yes.
No, Dick, all I was going to comment on was the difference between a weapons delivery system from space as opposed to a communications or intel system. And that,
Yeah.
I think, is what the question is.
Well, yeah, but you know, once again, you get in this blurred situation. If I miss the JDAM and I get my cueing to the target through GPS, GPS is becoming a killing system at that point.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. I mean, the reason we were able to work with the Northern Alliance in the early stages of the campaign in Afghanistan and collapse that government so quickly was because you had guys that were tactical air controllers operating on horseback, you know, the technology of the Middle Ages, but they had keyboards to orbiting buffs, dropping satellite cued munitions within 1,000 meters of where they were, able to call it in routinely. And so you see, that's where you get that blurring, you know, and that's the thing about technology. Technology is messy. It's, and I'm not saying that as a negative attribute. It's just that we have to be very, very careful when we take a look at technology, particularly in the international treaty arena and things like this, in terms of what you can inadvertently give up. The way people are able to kludge and work things together, it's astonishing what can have a military effect for you in this day and age. Other comments? Yes, sir.
One of the effects after World War I was the fact that our Army brass was in control of all of the Billy Mitchell incidents and so forth. And we got set back because there was no support at the highest level. In our future, our space and our aerospace leaders have got to be kept aware of and abreast of these technologies so that we don't ever fall again in that situation.
For those of you that may not have heard that comment, which by the way was extremely perceptive, it was the fact that commanders need to realize the advantages of air and space technology, because if they don't appreciate that, they can make some very bad decisions and we can wind up in a heap of trouble. And the example was that after World War I, the U.S. Army didn't particularly appreciate air power. For that matter, neither did the U.S. Navy. You know, the thing that really interests me is Billy Mitchell and Billy Moffett, two sides of the same coin. It's very unfortunate they did not get along because they actually had many of the same enemies, to be honest about it. You know, I think it was Trenchard said that the difference between himself and Mitchell was he believed in converting his enemies and Mitchell believed in killing them. But that may be a bit cruel. But I'm a huge Billy Mitchell fan. You know, in fact, I normally genuflect whenever his name is mentioned. But I will say this: we are dealing, almost in an anthropological sense, with thousands and thousands of years of surface-centric combat. And we're in the first century of three-dimensional warfare, warfare from above and below the surface. And it's very difficult to get people to see the advantages. You know, we hear a little bit of this in terms of what's happening right now. Well, we got to have boots on the ground. Well, you got to do this. You got to have those boots on the ground. Can't win this without ground forces, etc. People miss the issue of control. They miss the issue of control and they confuse it with occupation. Very, very dangerous business. You take a look at a three-dimensional system. Let's not take a look at the airplane. Let's take a look at the submarine. You know, in the Second World War, the submarine became the predominant ship killer, overturning thousands of years of previous tradition. If we take a look at the sinking of the Japanese fleet, you find that 48% of Japanese ships were sunk by submarines. 45% were sunk by airplanes. The rest were sunk in some cases by a partnership between the two or by some other form of attacker. That tells you that traditional surface combat, fleet to fleet, was very, very rare. You know, we talk about the Battle of San Bernardino Strait and, you know, Hood versus Bismarck and stuff like that. That's the exception of the rule. You know, World War I, that was the norm, not in World War II. And, you know, we're going to see this, I think, increasingly when we take a look at space. You know, there's going to be those people that can exploit space. There's going to be those people that don't have the ability to exploit space. But we really do have to change the mindset of commanders in the teaching at our war colleges, prospective commanders, in terms of how they look at force. One thing we really have to be very careful about is we can't cookie cut our experience looking at previous wars to think that we have now entered a new normative form of warfare where everything is going to be special operations. You're not going to need to do long-range precision engagement. You're not going to need to do this. You're not going to need to do that. Some of the stuff that we've been hearing just within the last few weeks has been overturned by the last 96 hours of combat operations, just for that point. Yes?
I was just going to comment that the undersurface, underground operations in World War I were not ignored by the North Vietnamese.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you take a look at tunneling, you take a look at embedding. You know, there was a reason in the Gulf War that we developed the GBU-28 bunker buster. It was because things were going deep. Yeah, exactly right. Yes, sir.
This is on Battle of Tannenberg.
Sure.
There was, I think it's the Russian first, God, whatever it is, but anyway, they did have was one aviation unit there, did fly some reconnaissance missions. Also with the Russian First Army under Renkov, there's supposedly a Russian Corps level aviation detachments did spot the German movement towards the Russian Second Army and reported it, but apparently...
Once again, their intelligence system. You're absolutely correct. There were Russian aircraft that flew at Tannenberg. However, there was a much more sporadic quality to it. And General Matos, the 15th Corps commander that I cited, said after the war that the reason he did not use the air power forces that were available to him was he was holding them for a more propitious moment. It's kind of like, what more propitious moment could possibly have existed? You're about to be enveloped and destroyed. You know, I think, you know, taking a look, Russia had some extraordinarily fine airmen and some extraordinarily fine designers. And that has continued, obviously, to the present day. But, you know, taking a look at that time period, it's very interesting to see how they were wasted, basically, in those opening weeks of the war. Yes?
In regards to that, prior to the war, there was a plan of development between aviation and the command structure. Russia, those individuals here who are not familiar with it, it was a very complex situation between Russian commands, and it wasn't as you would see it elsewhere. But there was a plan for aviation and army groups. But because the battle in the north was an impromptu battle, as opposed to the planned actions in the southwest, in Galicia, the organizational structure between the aviation units and the military command had not been well established.
Right.
And so it was more of an impromptu, send the aviation units in, and there was not that liaison and connection. And that's where the major disconnect happened.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. They certainly did better in the South than they did in the North, quite obviously. The other point, of course, that also had an intelligence side to it in terms of how Russian intelligence before the war had assessed Austro-Hungarian planning because of actually having a spy at the highest level of the Austro-Hungarian government, that sort of thing. I think also, I think there's some things here that are sort of known, maybe not fully appreciated, in one or two cases overblown. The enmity between Rennenkampf and Samsonov, which dated to the Russo-Japanese War, there's a feeling that it's been overblown in terms of explaining the action, but there's no doubt about it that Rennenkampf, although he played well as a cavalry commander in the Russo-Japanese War, he was very timid in his approach with the First Army. Samsonov was actually deployed his forces according to pre-war plan very, very well. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. But because Rennenkampf was very slow after Gunmin to undertake any sort of action whatsoever, you had this increasing gap develop that was just absolutely profound. Eventually, toward the end, it was just absolutely profound. And you know, obviously, that's the key factor that enables the very rapid recovery of the Eighth Army with very aggressive corps commanders like Francois, for example, and then the leadership above there, Hoffman, probably a little bit overrated. I'm not saying that he was bad, I'm just saying that he's probably given too much credit. For Ludendorff, Ludendorff is probably, oddly enough, not given enough. Ludendorff, before the First World War, had shown a profound interest in aeronautics, had actually flown before the First World War. He was very interested in what airmen could do. And then Hindenburg, who seems to have had a good sense for the ground and assembling forces and commanding them. Yes, sir, in the back.
And you did mention the Sikorski aircraft that even pre-war had 4 units.
Right, exactly.
Endurance, et cetera.
Yeah.
One of the things I wondered as the Allies on the Western Front were starting to try to develop a strategic bombing campaign.
Right.
Why they never utilized.
You know, it's very funny. It's very interesting to say that, because Sikorski wound up, well, Sikorski wound up working with the French toward the end of the war. And you know, if you take a look at some of the later Blériot bombing aircraft in that war, they have very much they have a tantalizing Sikorsky appeal to them, reflecting Sikorsky's aircraft in the 1920s. Take a look at some of his later aircraft like the S-29, and you see that there's this kind of funny indication that maybe he was having an influence, but it wasn't exploited. On the other hand, if you take a look at Caproni, I am astonished, looking at Caproni in detail, at how really advanced his thinking was, both in terms of bombing doctrine and how aggressively he was developing combat aircraft, and very good combat aircraft. You know, if you take a look at it, it's very, very, very intriguing. The one that still gets me, though, overall, is Hugo Junkers. You know, if you take a look at his airplanes toward the end of the First World War, Junkers is on the road to develop the cantilever twin-engine. Actually, it's a 4-engine, 2 coupled engines on each side. Long-range, all-metal bomber, and you think, this is mind-boggling, you know, that under different circumstances, you could have seen an aircraft such as that in service in 1920, 21, something of that sort. You know, it just really indicates, once again, how ironic it is that Germany in World War I has the exact same experience it has later on in 1945, where you have at the very end of the war a very high state-of-the-art aviation technology, and yet a totally screwed up acquisition system that just is unable to deliver things to the front. It's really an extraordinary story, of which John Morrow, by the way, has done a great deal of good work in telling. Other comments, questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just going to comment that the Ilium Warame is sort of an awkward design with a lifting horizontal tail, which is similar to Valerio, which
Right.
is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely right.
The Harriet Quimby accident is a classic
Yeah.
example of that, but when you
Yeah.
go pulling over to dive, it's just
Yeah,
lifting the tail
you're
right
actually,
upside down.
you're completely negating the value of the horizontal tail.
False D3,
Yeah.
realizing that problem, they have an inverted.
Yeah, as did the F4. I mean, you take a look at the later F4s, the F4Es have an inverted tail.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, there's a reason one puts a tail on an airplane. It's not for lift. Or at least not for that kind of lift. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir.
On the Samsonov Remenkopf, they supposedly hated each other's guts and got into a fist fight
Yeah.
during the Russo-Japanese War. Some accounts say that didn't happen, but the big problem at Tannenberg was the Northwestern Front commander, Zinsky,
Right.
just did not coordinate the two armies.
He was incredibly bad. The Russians were just very ill-served by their high command. And that point is correct. Zinsky above, and then Rennenkampf and Samsonov clearly had their differences. They did not get along. Whether they actually engaged in that fist fight at Mukden on the railroad station platform, you know, that's apocryphal. To my knowledge, there's no eyewitness account that's actually come out and said that they actually witnessed them doing it, you know. but there's no doubt that they didn't like each other. And that's not a prescription for good coordination right at the get-go, but certainly at the high command level. They were issued at best only vague guidelines on how to conduct their campaign, and there seems to have been very little attempt to understand how it was actually unfolding. But that may also reflect something else, and that was simply the state of communications and logistical capability that the Russians had themselves in that part of the world at that time. They're operating, after all, they're operating into an area that's very foreboding, marshy, very few roads, things like this. You know, that poses an operational constraint on both sides. But on one side, you have a relatively inferior road and rail network. On the other side, you have a very powerful industrial state with a very good road and rail service. And you take a look at the delivery of forces to that quagmire, it's certainly much more effective coming from Germany than it is from Russia. Other comments, questions? Thanks very much.